Welcome to the St. John Genealogy Project webcast. Today we will be exploring some lesser-known aspects of the St. John family, uncovering their fascinating stories and ancestral connections. Episode 1, John St. John of Penmark. In this episode, we will discuss the merging of John St. John of Penmark with John de Port St. John of Fonmon, and the merging of the two castles called Penmark in Glamorgan, Wales. Part 1. The Four Fees of Penmark, identifying the correct properties that made up this fee. In 1166, the Four Fees of Penmark were identified as being held by a man named Gilbert Umfreville. He held at this time 4 fees in Penmark and an additional 5 fees in Devon that he inherited from the Torrington family. Historians place Gilbert Umfreville as a companion of Robert Fitzhamon, Earl of Gloucester, who died in 1107, thus linking him to the conquering of Glamorgan that occurred toward the end of the 11th century, prior to 1100, when William Rufus was killed. There are no records naming the companions of Robert Fitzhamon, so it is illogical to make Gilbert his companion just because he appeared in the 1166 record, and the reason for this is because Gilbert died in 1245. This would make him over 145 years old at the time of his death, which is mathematically illogical. The next document related to the Four Fees of Penmark is called the Extent of Glamorgan. Historians have dated this document to 1262 as a companion to the 1262 Dispenser Survey, because they were found together in a collection of documents. It should be noted, however, that the Extent of Glamorgan was not dated, and it lists Gilbert Umfreville, who died before March 1245. Therefore, in my opinion, the Extent of Glamorgan should probably be dated to before March 1245. The 1262 Dispenser Survey documents the Four Fees of Penmark a little differently. In this record, instead of listing landholders by name, it details the Four Fees of Penmark were a total size of 3,395 acres. Unfortunately, none of these documents list out what the names of the 4 subfees were, but it does identify Penmark as an independent lordship made up of 4 knights' fees, and that these subfees were probably contained within the boundaries of the parish of Penmark. When historians tried to reverse engineer what they thought the 4 subfees were, they used the properties held by the, quote, St. John family, unquote. But the problem with this is that there were 2 St. John families in Glamorgan, Wales. The de Port St. Johns of Fonmon Castle, who descended from Adam de Port of Basing, and the St. Johns of Penmark, who descended from Ralph St. John of St. Jean le Thomas, the paternal ancestor of the St. Johns of Stanton St. John, Lacham, Instow, and East Lacombe in England. And this is where they began merging people with common names, properties of similar names, and collapsing many branches of the 2 families. This merging also resulted in the de Port St. Johns claiming the earlier ancestry of the St. Johns incorrectly. These issues could have been avoided if the historians had paid a bit more attention to the math, dates, and geography. The important bit of information that we need to take away from this is that the lordship of Penmark was 3,395 acres, and the 4 subfees that make up the 4 fees of Penmark must equal 3,395 acres exactly. When I started looking at the surveys listing the properties of Glamorgan, Wales, I was basically forced to research the Umfreville family. What I came to discover was historians once again published a lot of guesses that were not backed by any relevant and properly evaluated documentation. The biggest problem was the de Port St. John's family connections to the Umfrevilles. Historians created a fictional Elizabeth Umfreville that supposedly married a de Port St. John and made her the daughter of Henry Umfreville, who still held the 4 fees of Penmark in 1320.
When the related records are critically examined, it becomes obvious that this woman never existed as claimed, and that the de Port St. John family came to hold their lands before 1290. To support this fact, and found in papers for families prominent in Glamorgan, Wales, are statements that upend the historical claims for the Umfreville family related to the de Port St. John and St. John families. With these newly identified records, I was able to assemble a more plausible family tree for the Umfreville family. The first document of importance is the pedigree created for the ancestors of my Lord Herbert, identifying Roger Umfreville as the father of the woman that married William Cantilupe, the parents of Agnes Cantilupe, who married Robert de Port St. John of Fonmon. This, however, does not align with published claims by Douglas Richardson and others for the ancestry of Agnes Cantilupe. The next was a manuscript identified as Penarth Manuscript 134b, page 389, where Roger Umfreville was documented along with his coat of arms as holding Penmark. Because neither of these documents were dated, I had to look elsewhere to validate the existence of Roger Umfreville, and that is where I found Roger Umfreville of the Northampton Umfreville family, succeeded by his son Odyn II Umfreville. This Roger was omitted from both the family trees of the Umfrevilles of Northampton and the Umfrevilles of Glamorgan, and in doing so, historians claimed there were no connections between the, quote, two, unquote, families, when in fact they were the same family. It was the exact opposite situation as to how they processed the St. John families that were actually two families that they merged into one. The Monsell family papers additionally identified this Roger Umfreville, but the author that assembled their collection into a published book brought him forward in history by almost 300 years. Now, with consideration to all these newly identified facts, a family tree becomes easier to assemble without guessing relationships or the creation of fictional characters, and from this it becomes clear how the St. Johns and de Port St. Johns inherited their properties from the Umfrevilles.
Now, with a more correct Umfreville pedigree, it becomes clear that the Umfrevilles living in the time of Robert Fitzhamon were Robert Umfreville and his sons, including Odyn I Umfreville. Inserting Roger Umfreville, that historians omitted, between Odyn I and Odyn II fixes the succession of the holders of the Northampton properties and allows us to see the same family as that holding Penmark in Glamorgan, Wales. Now we can also see Roger Umfreville as the father of both Odyn II and the woman Mabel Umfreville that married William Cantilupe of Candlestown, Glamorgan, Wales, who were the ancestors of the de Port St. Johns of the Lordship of Llancarfan that included the 4 fees of Aberthal, where one of the sub-fees was known as Fonmon Castle. This also proves that we have no reason for the created fictitious Elizabeth Umfreville. Odyn II married Alice de Lucy, and her niece, Cicely de Lucy of Legeham, married Roger St. John of Stanton St. John, who were the ancestors of the St. Johns of the Lordship of Penmark. It should also be noted that one of the properties of Penmark is known as Penmark Place, a castle that once stood across the Kenson River from Penmark Castle, and this castle of Penmark Place was called the Manor of Odyn's Fee. I believe the term Odyn's Fee is a reference back to Odyn I, the son of Robert the Beard Umfreville and the father of Roger Umfreville of Penmark. I believe Robert Fitzhamon gave most of the land in Glamorgan, Wales to Odyn I for his service in the conquering of Glamorgan. From Odyn I, the large fee was divided up over time into separate lordships, so that by 1166, at least 70 years after the conquering of Glamorgan, the only remaining evidence of the Umfreville family was the 4 fees held by Gilbert Umfreville. There are also other records that identify how the Umfreville family held other properties that were recorded in 1166 as being held by families of other surnames, such as the Lordship of Ogmore, the Lordship of Llancarfan, including the 4 fees of Aberthal, and several other lordships. The 1320 survey here shows the plough lands that were applicable to each property. The 1429 survey is the first time we see the St. John name listed in a survey. And what historians did
was they merged two men named Oliver St. John as one man, because there were two entries. The first entry was Oliver de Port St. John. He was a knight, and he held the domain and castle of Penmark. He held land cattle, Landvithen, Fonmon Castle, and Barry Castle. Alexander St. John held the manor and fee of Highlight, or Ushaola. And the other Oliver St. John, who was the brother of Alexander, held what is known as the manor of Odyn's fee. So Fonmon, to be 820 acres, or 7 plowlands, means that it has to take up this entire area of Aberthal. And the interesting thing about that is, here we have in 1429, Fonmon is its own independent property. But when we go back to 1290, there is a deed that is held by the College of Arms that I'm not allowed to share. This deed was created circa 1290, and it documents that William de Port St. John, the Lord of Fonmon, deeded Aberthal to his brother Philip. Now, what this tells us is something that the historians missed. This tells us that the de Port St. John family already held Fonmon and Aberthal before 1290. The reason this is a problem is because the Umfreville family was still documented as holding the 4 fees of Penmark until 1415. So there is no way that Fonmon and Aberthal can be part of the 4 fees of Penmark, because the 4 fees of Penmark were still held, again, by the Umfreville family. They're documented as holding it in 1320. It gets passed down to Henry Umfreville's daughter, and then from her it descends down to her heiress, who was Alice Sturry, Alice Blount Sturry. And when she died in 1415, the 4 fees of Penmark transferred out of the Umfreville family. This is an important distinction that everyone needs to grasp in order to understand how Fonmon was never part of the 4 fees of Penmark. So what needs to be clear is that there was no such St. John of Penmark until after 1415. The Umfreville property passed to John Umfreville. He married the widow of Renfrew Arundel. Her name was Alice de la Herne. When John Umfreville died, the 4 fees of Penmark passed to his son Henry. Henry Umfreville married a woman named Isabella Unknown, and they had a daughter named Alice Umfreville. She was their only daughter. And then Alice married Matthew Furneaux, and they had a daughter named Elizabeth Furneaux. She married John Blount. They had a daughter named Alice Blount, and Alice Blount married Richard Sturry, and she died in 1415. When she died in 1415, she died without an heir. Therefore, the fees of Penmark reverted back to Alice de la Herne and her first husband, Renfrew Arundel. This is where the St. Johns and the de Port St. Johns inherited from the Umfreville family. Historians, making stuff up, created a fictitious sister to Alice Umfreville named Elizabeth Umfreville St. John. These historians will tell you she married Alexander, she married John, she married who knows. They don't know who she married because they made her up. The problem is that the reverse engineering and the creative license of these historians is the problem. There is a logical explanation. When you go back to the Arundel family, Alice de la Herne married Renfri Arundel, and her descendant was John Arundel. John Arundel first married Elizabeth Carminal, and his second wife was the widow of John de la Barre, Elizabeth Moulton. When Elizabeth Moulton de la Barre married John Arundel, they had to create the inheritance for her daughter with John de la Barre, and that was Elizabeth de la Barre. This Elizabeth de la Barre, the stepdaughter of John Arundel, married Oliver de Port St. John of Fonmon Castle. And as part of this marriage agreement, in 1370 to 1371, Elizabeth de la Barre de Port St. John was entitled to 1/4 of the fee of Penmark, the 4 fees. So now Penmark got split up into 1/4 fee and 3/4 fee. That 1/4 fee became known as Porthcary. So in 1371, the de Port St. Johns inherited a property, part of the 4 fees of Penmark, called Porthcary. This historians never document as being linked to the de Port St. John family. They just completely ignore it. So what happened with this Porthcary property is that when Oliver St. John and his wife Elizabeth de la Barre had children, they had 2 children, John and Alexander. John inherited Fonmon, and Alexander inherited Porthcary. So that by the 1400s, when Alice Blount Sturry died, Alexander received his inheritance of Porthcary. The remaining 3/4 fees of Penmark went to John St. John. And the reason John St. John was an heir is because his ancestor, the daughter of John Arundel, married Alexander St. John of East Lacombe and Instow. And that marriage allowed their descendants to also be an heir of the Umfreville family through the Arundel family. So Oliver St. John, the son of Alexander St. John of Instow and John Arundel's daughter, married Elizabeth Lacombe. Elizabeth Lacombe was the daughter of Hugh Lacombe and Elizabeth Unknown. Upon the death of Hugh Lacombe, Elizabeth, his widow, then married widower Alexander St. John of Instow. So the father married the mother, and the son, from his first wife, married the daughter of his second wife, Elizabeth Lacombe. And the family, the St. Johns of Instow, then inherited, by marriage, the property called East Lacombe. Oliver and Elizabeth had a son named John, and John married Elizabeth de la Barre of Webley Castle. She is not to be confused with the Elizabeth de la Barre of Tolverne that married Oliver de Port St. John. Again, historians like to merge people just because they have a common name. We have to understand that there was more than one de la Barre family. There was more than one Elizabeth de la Barre. There was more than one Oliver St. John, and so on. So this John St. John of East Lacombe married Elizabeth de la Barre of Webley. Her parents were John de la Barre of Webley Castle and Agnes Tuberville of Coity Castle. The other Elizabeth, if you'll remember, Elizabeth de la Barre of Tolvern, was the daughter of John de la Barre of Tolvern and Isabella de Moulton, who then married John Arundel. John St. John of East-Lacombe and his wife Elizabeth de la Barre became the parents of John St. John, and this John St. John was living in 1415, and he is the one that inherited the 3/4 fees of Penmark in 1415. Now, what happened here with John is a very interesting story. It was documented in a legal case. His father, John St. John, died overseas soon after the grandfather Oliver died. So Oliver St. John died in 1374, and then within a year or two, his son, who was fighting overseas, also died. His widow, Elizabeth de la Barre, gave birth to their son, John, but because of a Welsh custom, John was documented as a bastard. Now, the term bastard back then meant that he was a child who was not legally recognized by his father. So in Wales, whether your parents were married or not, your father had to formally recognize the child as his child in order for that child to inherit from him. So he could have children born in and out of wedlock who were his heirs, so long as he acknowledged that those, yes, are my kids. So unfortunately, Elizabeth de la Barre in this case got pregnant by her husband, her legal husband. He then went off to war overseas, probably in France, and he was killed there. And so his child, according to the mother, was born in England. The king at the time was aware that this child was born. However, Henry St. John, the younger brother of Oliver, contested the legal rights of this child. And at first, the king supported the child, and this legal battle went on for several years. Henry kept pushing it until he got a jury trial. The jury determined that the child was an infant bastard. In other words, he was born without his father's acknowledgement, and therefore he was not an heir to East-Lacombe, based on the terms of inheritance for East-Lacombe. So Henry then took possession of East-Lacombe, and John the child became the heir of his mother, and he inherited Webley Castle. Upon the death of Alice Blount Sturry, he then inherited 3/4 fees of Penmark. And this John St. John has been merged with John de Port St. John, the older brother of Alexander de Port St. John, who inherited Porthcurry. This John St. John married a Philippa Mortimer. Historians again have tried to merge her with another Philippa Mortimer. This one, I believe, was from Breconshire. This Philippa Mortimer is probably the aunt or the cousin of the Philippa Mortimer that married Thomas Poyning's Lord St. John. So John St. John and Philippa, his wife, then had several children. They had a son named John, who married the heiress of Dinas Powys and the de Someri family, and he inherited by marriage a property called Highlight. He and his wife died without heirs, and so Highlight passed to his brother Alexander. Another son was Oliver. Oliver inherited Odyn's fee. So you have Alexander of Highlight, you have Oliver of Odyn's fee. Then you have a daughter named Agnes. Agnes inherited Webley Castle from her grandmother, Elizabeth de la Barre. And then there were a couple other children. I have all these children that are documented as the children of this John St. John of Penmark. The John de Port St. John of Fonmon was never really at Fonmon. He was in Northamptonshire.
And this is something that the historians also misunderstand. So when we find these records in Glamorgan, Wales, a majority of them fit this family, these descendants of John of Penmark. The problem is that, yes, the de Port St. John's did hold Fonmon, they did hold Penmark Castle, they did have Bury Castle. They let these castles go to ruin because they were in England. They went to England in the 1300s or earlier. In 1346, Fonmon was held by Thomas Ab Aaron, who was the sheriff of Glamorgan. So there was no record of the de Port St. John's at Fonmon after 1346, except for the 1429 survey that said it was held by Oliver. And this is an important distinction to understand because a lot of the records in Glamorgan, Wales have been credited to the de Port St. John family when in fact they belong to the St. John family. Part 2. Proving John St. John of Penmark is a St. John and not a de Port St. John. The evidence John St. John of Penmark was the ancestor of American immigrants Matthias St. John and Matthew St. John of Dorchester, Massachusetts. So more evidence that the de Port St. Johns were not in Glamorgan was the 1531 visitation by William Fellows. He was part of the College of Arms. He was a herald. And he went to Wales and went into Glamorgan, Wales, and did a visitation, which is basically taking a survey of who was holding the lands in that area. So the only St. John family documented in 1531 by William Fellows was John St. John of Penmark's family. And this visitation record clearly shows that this is the family of Odyn's fee and highlight. And it calls him Sir John St. John of the Castle of Penmark, Glamorganshire. And his issue was John Alexander Agnes, and he had a daughter named Marjorie who married Alexander de Port St. John, the holder of Porthcurry. And the interesting thing about this document is historians claim that the St. Johns of this family right here, this John, they claim that he is John de Port St. John. Now, this document was brought over from Wales to colonial America and was part of John Winthrop's papers. John Winthrop was the first governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony when Matthias St. John and Matthew St. John went to Dorchester. So this document was brought over from Wales to colonial America, and it was in Winthrop's papers to document the St. Johns who lived in his colony. Now, if this was the de Port St. John's, RY-DNA, descendants of Matthew and Matthias, would match the de Port St. John family. But what we have instead is our own DNA that documents the St. John family, and that this is clear evidence that the St. Johns who came to Dorchester colony originated from the St. Johns of Penmark and Highlight. And here we have John St. John, his children documented. Alexander is documented as holding Highlight. We have Odyn's fee documented here as part of Penmark. And it also documents that this John St. John in 1415 participated in the Battle of Agincourt, and that he survived, and that he was given a coat of arms that was slightly different from the St. John's, or the de Port St. John's. So what we learn from this is that we have John St. John of Webley Castle and 3/4 of Penmark, and his wife Philippa Mortimer of Breconshire. And their children were Marjorie St. John, and she was the eldest daughter, and therefore she was given 1/4 fee of Penmark from her father. He had 3 fees. He gave her 1/4 fee, and it was called Westbury. And on the map, it is the turquoise blue, and there is a castle there called Bury Castle. This daughter, Marjorie St. John, the daughter of John, married Alexander de Port St. John, the heir of Porthcary. And when they got married, they combined their 2 fees, and then they together held half the fee of Penmark. So they brought those 2 fees back together. And what this property then became called was Westbury. Porthcary and Westbury were merged together under a new name called Westbury. And they were, Westbury with Bury Castle was 4 plowlands, 480 acres. And then Porthcary was 635 acres. And then the other child, Oliver, the oldest son, he inherited half of Odyn's fee. That included 1/2 fee of Penmark Place, Castle or Odyn's fee, and then the plowlands, the 15 plowlands of Penmark. And that together totaled 1,800 with the plowlands, and then 480 for Odyn's fee. And all 4 of these fees, Porthcary, Bury, Odyn's fee, and Penmark plowlands, totals 3,395 acres exactly. And the map that I used is a documented map from Glamorgan, Wales, and it documents the parish of Penmark. This entire area is what is considered the parish of Penmark, but the actual fees of Penmark are what I have highlighted in colors, and I mapped them on Google Earth so that I got the exact measurements and how many acres were there. So this came to exactly 3,395 acres. There is no way that we can squeeze Fonmon into that. And you'll notice Fonmon Castle is over on the left, over in part of Aberthaw. Penmark Castle is north of the purple, and it's not part of this area either. So the only castle that did ultimately end up with the de Port St. John's was Bury Castle, and that was because it was merged with Porthcary through the marriage of Marjorie and Alexander. And this is pretty interesting because what historians also did was they merged this Alexander de Port St. John of Porthcary with his wife's brother, Alexander St. John of Highlight. And this is again why we have so much merging. We have the father being merged with Alexander's brother. We have Alexander being merged with John's son Alex. We have this Oliver being merged with the other Oliver at the Fonmon family. So it's very important that people are very careful when they're documenting this. And the easiest way to make sense of it is to follow these properties. Now, what's not documented here is where did this family get Fonmon and Penmark, the de Port St. John family. Where did the de Port St. John family get Fonmon and Aberthaw? Where did they get land cattle? Where did they get Landvithen? And where did they get Penmark Castle? It's not documented in any of this because it was not part of the 4 fees of Penmark. They got their properties before 1290. And in the next episode, I will document how that came about. But what we can clearly see here right now is that the de Port St. John's at no time held the 4 fees of Penmark. At most, they acquired half. One through descent and another through marriage, totaling 3,395 acres when the 2 families' properties are combined.
According to Glamorgan archaeologist Howard J. Thomas, the 4 fees of Penmark were Odyn's fee, Westbury, Penmark, and Fonmon. If this were a true claim and not made up by Thomas himself or an earlier historian, then the lordship would have been in excess of plowlands by 205 acres, making the lordship 3,600 acres instead of 3,395 acres. From the 1320 survey, we know that these properties had a specific plowland value that, when multiplied by 120 acres, gives us the total acreage for each subfee, so that Odyn's fee was 4 plowlands or 480 acres, Westbury was also 4 plowlands or 480 acres, Penmark farmlands was 15 plowlands or 1,800 acres, and Fonmon was 7 plowlands or 840 acres. These 4 fees, based on their documented plowlands, would be equal to 3,600 acres, and 205 acres too many, because according to the 1262 dispenser survey, the 4 fees of Penmark were 3,395 acres instead. What's obviously missing is the Porthcarry property carved out in the Blount deeds back in 1371. If we now add in this property, Howard Thomas is suggesting the 4 fees of Penmark are 4,235 acres, and we know that is absolutely incorrect. We must replace Fonmon with Porthcarry to get exactly 3,395 acres, indicating Fonmon with East Aberthaw is almost certainly instead one of the 4 fees of Aberthaw held by the Deneerbeard Cantilupe family. And this makes sense because we know that Robert de Port St. John of Basing married Agnes Cantilupe.